this child is severely impacted by fungally moldy environments. And they're in a location now where the environment is okay and things are better under control. But like literally anytime he's exposed to anything fungally, including at the grandparents' house for like an hour, things just really flare. At the beginning, like they found the mold and they moved. And then they were there for a little while. They found mold there. They moved. They found mold again.
I'm excited to have you back on the show, Jen, so we can talk about mold. Welcome
I'm
back.
so excited. Thank you. I'm so excited to be here to talk about this. I get so many questions about it. And so I think it's going to be really nice to have this in a place where I can refer people to give them my thoughts on the subject, because I do have some maybe somewhat strong opinions about it.
Well, I will say, I think, we get a lot of questions like, first of all, what exactly is mold? What is kind of like in that family, which a lot of people don't think about, where it hides? Are there like sneaky ways to kind of figure out if you have mold? Do you have to like be or live in an entirely mold-free environment? Thoughts on testing, especially like the environmental versus the body, looking for mycotoxins. I mean, we're going to talk about a lot of things today, so I'm super excited that actually this was your idea, that we are now going to dive into what I like to say is the conversation about the fungus among us. Exactly, the fungus among us. So you get asked a lot by parents who are super panicked, right? They're super panicked because their kids are having a meltdown. And naturally so, because I feel like children have less bandwidth to be able to emotionally and kind of cope with what they're experiencing when their skin is like all out of sorts. So what do you tell a parent who is like, oh my gosh, my child's skin is freaking out. Do I have mold? Like, do you think it's mold? What do you think I should do here? Is it mold? Do I need to leave my home?
Yeah, really good question. And, with kids also, I see kids that are so young and they can't even communicate, why they're so upset or what's happening. But it's obvious because their skin is just on fire, weepy, raw, red, itchy. And mold, I will say this too. I am not a mold expert. If you do have mold, suspect mold, what have you, definitely work with somebody who is a mold specialist. I do work with my clients with mold. However, it's not why they initially come to me. It's something that can be contributing to what's happening with their child's skin, in which case I can help with that. But, there's a point where depending, and we can talk about this today too, depending on the exposure, if it actually is a problem, how severe that problem is, where you really need to see a specialist. That said, I also feel like right now, there's always kind of like the sexy trigger out there, right? Like there's something out there that people are chasing. And I think one of the things that gets chased nowadays, and it's popular to go down this rabbit hole, is mold. Now, yes, it absolutely can be a problem, and I have seen it be a problem. However, what I tell parents is that it really isn't the place to start. If you see it, suspect it, what have you, that is a conversation that we can have. If you don't see it in your home, don't really have any reason to suspect that it is an issue. It's really one of those things that's like reserved, in my opinion, for a little bit farther down our healing journey. That's really where I start with parents having that conversation. I also have a lot of parents that come to me with already having gotten, I won't say the name of the test, but there are certain tests out there that are really popular right now that are easy to get, where you can, check dust in your home, swab samples and things like that to see if there is mold, like, in the dust, in the air, things like that. And something to keep in mind with that too, it's just like, just because if you do find it, it doesn't necessarily mean it is a problem either.
That is
it can
true.
kind of go either way. And then the other way I look at it also, it's like, well, is it actually coming from inside the home, like dust, air, whatever, or Is it in the environment, trees, whatever is happening outside
Yeah.
your home? You open the door, things come in. So
Right.
it's kind of ambiguous.
This episode is brought to you by my line of professional grade supplements called NutriQuel. I crafted these supplements especially for those struggling with chronic skin rash issues and based the formulations on my extensive research and clinical experience in my private practice. They are made from the highest quality ingredients and tested to be free of different allergens so that you can support your gut, liver, and overall health with the formulas that I've found work best for my skin rash warrior clients without triggering a flare. I'm excited to share them with you, so check them out at quellshop.com and use the coupon code GET15OFF to get 15% off your first order. I'll put a link in the description below. And now let's jump back to the video.
Well, so I think that's to my point, like in saying there's fungus among us, right? So I think first of all, it's important. I always say we've got to understand what mold is. Mold is fungus. And I think people get caught up with like, oh, they're really interested in candida. And then they're really interested in mold, but they don't really connect the two because they're all fungus. It's all together the same family. They're different organisms, but they're all fungus. And so that's a really important point. And for me, I work with adults, and it is not uncommon that someone is living to some level, not all clients, but some are living in a fungally environment. I do like to look at what's happening in the home, the workplace, and I'm happy to talk to about like some of the, I don't know, maybe we'll talk about some like mold hiding spots. I found some like really sneaky mold hiding spots. I know we're gonna try and touch on some of those today, but a fungally environment, in my view, contributes to and influences the gut microbiome. And so for me, I do want to know if that's going on, but your point, I think, is fair. When people think that their home is under attack, because that's how it feels when somebody says, I have mold exposure. I can tell everyone here, I have mold exposure. I have mold. Probably, I would guess, a little bit in my basement because I live in the Northeast, and it is very common where I live that when we have really, really heavy torrential downpours, we get like a little stream through the basement that drains into the drain. So I wouldn't be surprised if we have some mold in our home, but I've done testing. I know that there's not a whole lot there, and my husband and I are not genetically prone to have trouble being in that environment, but it's a different story if like literally the walls are covered in mold. The floors are covered in mold. It's all behind the walls. It's under the roof. It's like we have to think about the degrees and then how susceptible we are. So I think there's a variety of considerations, but I just want to say very clearly, I think the conversation that many have online scares people to a point where they don't even want to bother to look, because this is your home. Your home is a place where you want to feel safe in. And when you have mold, this invisible kind of thing that's lurking, that could be making you ill, all of a sudden, you're now afraid of your books. You're afraid of your sheets. You're afraid of your carpeting. You're afraid of your sofa. You become afraid of everything in your home. And that is extremely unsettling. So I'm not saying that that's not a problem, but I think the way we have conversations about this has to change, because for many people who are ill, their nervous system is already on overdrive, and then to have that lumped on top becomes like so overwhelming that you just like can't even process it at that point. So that's, I think, like I said, I want to have a balanced conversation. So that's why I love that you brought this up and said like we should talk about this, because it's something that there's a lot of fear, right? Don't you get that from parents when you talk to them? Like this level of I don't know, is it panic that you hear in their voice? Fear? Like,
Oh, absolutely. I can tell a little story around this. And I want to talk to some of the points that you made too. I was like taking little notes because some of the things that you said, I think are really important to touch on. I'll go back to that. But I actually have a client now who just getting started. We did some testing, know the child has significant candida overgrowth in her gut. Also urinary organic acid, so in the urine as well, which is actually a better indicator of, fungal dysbiosis coming from the gut specifically. But so this kid has really high levels of fungal dysbiosis, and they did the home dust testing, found there were some levels, but it wasn't anything where I would even have said like, oh my God, you have to get out of the house. But they're just really grasping at straws, very panicky, very terrified. It's a very young child who's extremely uncomfortable and her skin is in very severe condition. So it's understandable that the parents are panicked. So bad to the point that, and we've been talking, we just got started with things, just got started with a plan. It's going to take time, to resolve some of this. And, my stance on this is that there were other imbalances as well. It wasn't just high candida. There was a lot happening with this child. So the level of mold that was found on the testing, in my opinion, is not what's causing the problem. Can it be triggering and making things worse? Maybe. However, they're so panicked that kind of in the midst of me trying to talk them down and, just, hey, we're going to get there. Like, we've just got to go through the process. They moved out of their home and they're in an Airbnb now, and they're going to be there for 3 months. After being out, and this is a thing too, like if the environment is something that's really triggering for what's happening with somebody's health, typically when somebody leaves that environment, they're going to start to feel better pretty quickly. So it had already been about 3 weeks in this other place, no changes with the child. So just an example.
Can I just insert for a moment? Like there's been so many stories I've heard where Airbnbs are loaded with mold in like their AC units and all sorts, because they're not cleaning it to the level and checking for that.
That's a really good
Just an
You know what?
FYI.
That's a really good point. I have had some clients. You know what? This is reminding me of all kinds of experiences with this now. I have somebody else. They're actually up north, so in an area where it is more moist. And this child is severely impacted by fungally moldy environments. And we know this, like they've moved around to the point, and they're in a location now where the environment is okay and things are better under control. But like literally anytime he's exposed to anything fungally, including at the grandparents' house for like an hour, things just really flare. Like we're still working on clearing things out for him, but at the beginning, like they found the mold and they moved, and then they were there for a little while. They found mold there. They moved. They found mold again. So it continued to happen. And it took it. I mean, I can't even imagine what this family was going through, because, you're dealing with, health issues, your child's skin, all of this stuff. And now you're moving from place to place to place.
Can I ask you?
It does happen. Mm-hmm.
Did the child also have a mold allergy?
That's a really good question. Yes, he did have a mold allergy.
Yeah,
so
see, that complements it, right? Or
It
complicates it.
It does. So, and that's too, it's like there is a difference between, we're talking about, like when we're talking about the mycotoxin testing and seeing things in the urine, when it comes to the mold testing, we are talking more about like a mold toxicity, where the mold like is in the person's body. That's what that's detecting, versus a mold allergy, which is like another environmental allergy. So you could be allergic to mold that's like, in the grass outside of your home. So there are a lot of nuances to this. Yeah. And it does make it a very tricky rabbit hole. It does.
And I think it's worthwhile to mention you can have a mold allergy and be exposed and have high levels of mycotoxins. So those are two separate things that can be true at the same time, which complicates things. I'll share really quickly. I have a client she has a mold allergy, and she's got a lot of allergies to different types of molds and yeasts and all sorts of things. She was very allergic. Like her list of allergies when I started working with her was like off the charts. So it was very difficult to find like supplements and topical products that she could use without reacting to them. And she lived in North Carolina, which is a humid environment. They get hit by hurricanes. So a lot of areas that are more hurricane prone, you should probably suspect there could be mold in your house. I'm just like, that's an FYI. Not guaranteed, but like that's a possibility. And so anyway, I said, look, I think you have mold probably somewhere in your house. They got some testing. They showed that like an area of the house had like a high level of mold. And then I forget what happened, but she had some discoloration of the rug in her car and it was black. And I was like, how did that happen? And she pulled it back and it was like all black. And I'm like, you got black mold in your car, which, I mean, look, you can get mold in the car. The mold can be in the AC ducts, the vents, right? So that's another problem because we don't clean those things, right? And so, she had to get I don't remember what exactly happened, but I was like, you're literally driving around in a vehicle that has something in it that you are A, allergic to, and B, for whatever reason, she can't process and handle being around like the rest of, she's got kids and a husband and they're basically fine. And she can't. And it's likely because I think really there's this genetics piece that makes some people have much more difficulty in clearing mycotoxins. And so the loads build and build and build, and they just can't seem to outrun it or live amongst it. And the level was high and the rest of the family was pretty much fine, which is like wild. But either way, I think there's a lot of places that mold hides. And I've found like some of the sneakiest spots with clients. I'm not an expert, but I'm like very good at digging. But yeah, I agree with you. And I hate to say that. I hate to throw fear into somebody who's like, oh my gosh, I'm going on vacation and I love to rent these like homes, but just keep in mind there's nobody living there, so you don't know. There's nobody, you know what I mean? It's not like the AC is going to be on all the time. They could have a water leak and that could go on for days and nobody's going to know, and then they just clean up the mess and they go about their business and continue renting the unit. So it is possible to, even though like you think like, oh, I'm renting this place, it's possible that it could be there too.
Very possible. I want to touch on the susceptibility because I think it's so fascinating. And I do agree with you on this too. Like everybody is systems are different. And yes, there's absolutely a genetic component to that. Also with kids, their bodies don't detox as well. They don't clear things out as effectively a lot of times compared to adults. Genetic mutations are not. So kids can be more susceptible. I did want to mention that piece. I also wanted to talk too about, where some people, like exactly like you mentioned, she was really affected, but her kids weren't. And you said something earlier too about how the mold can actually adversely impact the gut microbiome. So I see it. Yes, it can. And I actually kind of see it the opposite way too, because the way I look at it, and this is the approach I take with kids, is that 70 to 80% of the immune system is located in your gut. So if somebody is more reactive to something than somebody else, why? Why is their immune system so much more prone to inflammation? Sure, there's a genetic piece. That can always be the case. But I always look at the gut for that. And I will tell you, even in these cases where I have seen that mold, this is why I consider mold a trigger and not necessarily a root cause. So yes, mold can impact all of these things, but there's a reason why this person is sicker or more impacted than anybody else. And I take it back to, okay, let's see what's happening in their gut. And I do. There's other things, like maybe we don't even see candida in there, which is very common not to, even if it is an issue. But there's H. pylori or just opportunistic overgrowth in general, or, all of these other imbalances. And then also to your point, it just made me think, because you said that how, mold impacts all of that. Well, how do we know what came first, chicken or the egg?
That is very true. That is true. You have a good point.
And they both impact each other. So then it just becomes a vicious cycle. So who knows what happened first? But I have to beg to differ that the gut imbalances would have happened first?
Okay, so I just want to let's try playing this out
I'm
and
just
see how
trying, I
each of us.
know. I'm
I
like,
know.
wait.
So
Okay.
what happens? So this is like what we do when we're looking through a case, and I'm trying to figure out like what happened. So let's say like I have clients that have had rashes since they were a baby, and they're now like in their 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s. So they've got like decades of health problems, rashes. Maybe they had some periods where they were clear and then it came back, and so I always am very curious when things flare back up and represent themselves. And a lot of times one trigger is usually like college. So so this is like my thought process. And I don't know how you feel about this, but like, I think a lot of dormitories are loaded with mold. I do. A lot of them are old, not all. I think a new building might be a different story, but I think a lot of buildings are like institutional type buildings, dormitories, etc., are loaded with mold. College students
They smell like they are.
I know. And college students, think about it. When we were college students, like I lived in dumps. I have to be honest. Like I lived in dumps in like Greenpoint, Brooklyn, and in Canarsie, Brooklyn. And I lived in places that I could afford, but like some of them were less clean than others and not in the greatest of shapes, but that's what I could afford. So I feel like college students, unless you really have, you get a really good job out of college or whatever your circumstance may be, most people are probably living in apartments, homes, etc., that are maybe not to the par that we would and our age expect them to be. And so there's probably more likelihood for mold. Now, does that mean that they currently still have mold? Well, no. They may have had that mold in the past that could have possibly influenced their environment, and then they kept moving forward in time, and now they've got this like significant fungal overgrowth. So that's one of the reasons why I agree with you. Testing isn't perfect. Even the mycotox test, there's problems with it. But I think institutional buildings, and when I say institutional buildings, I mean, like I said, dorms. I consider libraries. I would say a lot of like colleges, hospitals, gyms. Churches. I would think any type of building, and I will say a lot of office buildings, they have mold. I mean, look up. We go to how many of us go to an office building with drop ceilings? When you look up and you start seeing all of those dried wet spots on the ceilings, there's a high likelihood there was either a pipe that burst or is leaking or the roof leaked at some point. Now, how well they actually clean that up, TBD, who knows? But I will just share, I had a client who was a medical doctor and a surgeon. His situation was very weird. He had like some rashes that were his main concern. But then he shared with me that he had migraines. I'm going through his case, and this is like a grown man. I think he's like in his 50s, early 50s. I mean, he's not like a young kid out of college or whatever. And I go, your cholesterol's low. And he's like, what do you mean? My doctor said the cholesterol's good. I was like, yeah, but it's under 150. He's like, that's weird. Do you have any mold in your house? And he's like, no. We had issues in the past. We completely like dealt with it. Everything's clear in the home. And I'm like, okay, but your cholesterol is under 150. So when total cholesterol is under 150, that can be a sign of mycotoxin exposure. And I was like, I really need you to think about where you spend a lot of time, because you're now complaining about every time you go to the office on Mondays, you get these really, really bad migraines. And he's like, come to think of it, my staff also gets headaches as well. They all complain of headaches. And I said, do you have is it a drop ceiling? He said, yeah, actually, sometimes the ceiling tiles are so saturated with water, they fall to the floor. And I'm like, you have mold in your office. And lo and behold, the office space that they were in was loaded with mold. And it had not occurred to him. And had it not been for that one thing, I don't know that I would have gotten any further, because he was really insistent that he had no mold exposure. And so I just think we discount how much we're around mold. Again, it's not to make people panicked. And I do have clients who've had some really, really traumatic experiences, and because they have come from significant mold illness, which is different than just like, oh, I kind of have some mold in my house and I'm able, like me, I'm able to be around it. It's not the end of the world, because I really don't think living mold free is like, I don't think that's practical for most people. I'm just being honest. But I think institutional buildings, gyms, and some of these places and your car is another possible suspect. I think we have to like give a good side eye, not necessarily with the intent to be afraid, but as we start thinking about our case history, we don't think about just now. We also have to think about in the past. Like I said, that person that started to develop issues after or during or after college, I want to think about like, what was that environment? Oh, you also partied, you drank alcohol, you ate tons of pizza and horrible, like, carby diet with lots of sweets. That to me is like, that counts.
Right. It does. And it's interesting too, like thinking along those lines, it's kind of like, when do you start to suspect it? Like when do you start to really go down that rabbit hole? So just some examples, and like, we were talking about the institutional buildings. I had an interesting case where, we were working for a while, on this child's gut. We did the organic acids, like, all the other root cause stuff, right? So we're working on that, getting improvements. So things were moving in the right direction, but just kind of stuck. They lived in a dry climate. They're in the desert, and they new construction, like literally brand new construction. And later found out they did preschool at the local church, and mom also worked in the local church, so they spent a lot of time there. So she wasn't just there a few days for preschool, she was there like every day. So I don't even know exactly how they identified it in the church. It was like through other reasons, and they found it, church remediated, and she's fine. Another case is sort of similar. So these are just like some examples. Like if you're worried about mold, like I think this is when you start going down that rabbit hole. Another child I was working with, and this one was a long case. We had worked together it was probably about a year. His skin looked great. So like you couldn't see eczema, like that was gone. He had eczema. So his skin looked great, but he was super itchy and super constipated. And no matter what we were doing, like those things were not getting much movement. There were like slight glimpses, but then like nothing. And we had talked about exposures and what else is going on, and doing the fact finding and the questioning, and had asked about, mold. And they're like, no, we don't see any, there was some in the bathroom, but, we clean it up. And I'm like, probably not then, there was no indication of anything. Then I get a message from the family. And so turns out they were in the Northeast. So, winters were very cold and it was drier. So they ran a whole house humidifier basically all year long, which they hadn't told me about that. So they run this thing all year long, and the dad had to go in the attic for something. He opens up the attic, hadn't been in there in like over a year. The entire attic covered in mold.
Wait. So the humidifier was in. Wait, so they left a humidifier running in the attic?
So it was like a whole. I live in California, so I'm not sure how this works, but they had a whole house humidifier, which was in the attic, and it ran all the time. I don't know if like we have things here like old fashioned air conditioners, like swamp coolers. Yeah. So they run off with whatever. So I don't know if it was something like that. Don't know the technology, but so they had a whole house humidifier that they kept running all the time that lived in the attic. And it was just, they said sopping wet and covered with mold. So right there, gosh. So we had our answer. But I will say too, yes, this kid had a lot happening in his gut. He did have some fungal stuff happening in there that we identified, but there were a lot of other things happening too. But that was the piece of the puzzle that had been missing. And there was nothing that could have been done further until they got out of that environment and got that remediated.
Yeah. And I think I just want to say this, because I do think we're talking about the US, but if you're listening and you're in the UK, there's so much mold in the UK and buildings. And it's a damp, wet environment, generally speaking. I mean, every client I have worked with has had issues with that. I've had clients who are in New Zealand, in Australia, who've had issues with it. But like, it's interesting how other cultures don't seem to be, and other countries don't seem to be as savvy about the mold problem. And a lot of times they're like, oh, well, in my one client, she's like, oh, well, the landlord had the workers come in and just bleach the wall, which I'm like, no, like bleach makes it worse. Do not bleach mold. They don't know. And then she's like, well, it kind of looks clean, so it's probably fine. And I'm like, no, it's not fine, because it keeps just coming back. So I do think that if you are in, if you're outside of the US, and I do think if you look around and you smell, you also don't have to smell mold to have mold. I'm shocked that those people, did they not have a musty smell in their house with that humidifier?
Maybe they apparently not, or they lived there, so they were used to it.
They were used to it, maybe. That's
I don't
so
know.
interesting. That is horrifying. See, that's the instance, right? That's what I was saying. Like, I have a stream, a little trickle when it rains a lot through my basement. I mean, maybe the stream is like 2 inches wide. It's not like that. That is like, to me, on a level of being catastrophic, where to have that remediated, you need to be out of the house. That's not...
Absolutely. And this is another thing I should mention this too, because we were talking about susceptibility. So in this family, like, the parents were like fine. Everybody had some symptoms, but they had 2 children. The other one also had skin issues. So when everybody in an environment certainly is, sort of experiencing something, that's another question I ask my clients. Like, if they think there's mold and they want to go down that rabbit hole, okay, well, how is everybody else? And again, I really am focused on the person and the person who's feeling unwell, because that's where we have the opportunity to make their immune system robust to help them handle anything. Because really the goal, sorry, a little tangent, the goal in this type of work is not to make everything perfect externally and internally.
Right. Agreed.
The way I look at it, it's like we've got to knock the triggers down and fix the internal balances to a point while we're working on improving and making that person's immune system more robust, so that then they can handle things that come at them. So it's kind of
they're
like
more
this
flexible.
Right.
More
So
flexibility.
Right. So there's that. But I think too, so in the instances where, everybody in the household is having some symptoms, then, absolutely, I think it's something to explore deeper versus well, no, and no, there's no difference when we're somewhere else either. So probably not, so those are just kind of some.
Yeah. And I think it's good if you are really dealing with a true mold illness, like that family that had, I can't even imagine opening up the attic crawl space and just finding
I can't even imagine.
I mean, I would be I'd be like, we're moving today. We're out of here. When you're in a situation like that, that's where, you have to consider true mold illness. That's where you want to really look for a mold literate doctor. You're looking and considering mycotoxin illness, and especially to help you avoid it. If you're kind of doing okay, you don't want to be in it while they remediate, because then you expose yourself to mycotoxins as they remediate. So you want to be out of that environment while that's happening, and consider other conditions depending on severity. Like really, really, really sick individuals, you're looking at true mold illness, sears, those kind of conditions. And I think that's where you really want to look towards a mold literate doctor, not let me do some food sensitivity testing and I'm going to take some binders and do a detox or something. I think that's where you really need to, unfortunately, get some significant help with that process to try and dig yourself out of that hole. Because there may be medications that are involved. It can be a long journey, and you really want to get the support that you need. So My gosh, Jen, I feel like we have like so many more things to say on this, so maybe we'll have to do this again. There's like so many more rabbit holes to go down and talk about here. But that being said, obviously you have your clinical practice where people can, especially specifically parents, because you work with little ones with skin challenges, can find you over at jenniferkarenbrandnutrition.com. And we'll actually put, I think, which would be great, we'll put your website, and we'll also put, I know you've got some really great free guides that people can download, especially around itch and whatnot. So we'll put some links into the show notes for you on those. And then obviously I have my practice. I work virtually all over the world with adults who are struggling with chronic skin problems. So I'll put the link down below if you're looking for some help with that, and diving into this whole topic of the fungus among us.
The fungus among us.
The fungus among us. But thank you, Jen, for being here today. I'm glad we could do this.
Thank you for having me.
If you enjoyed this video, you need to tune in to this video next. Then make sure to hit the subscribe button so you get notified as soon as a new episode drops. I'm excited to see you there and dive deeper with you on your skin healing journey.